Hello there, lads and lassies. Welcome to Scottish Geeks. Today, we're going to be doing a live creepypasta reading. This is not going to be a long live stream. This is just purely because I can't be arsed editing. But I've been looking through some creepypastas and then I thought, do you know what? I'm just going to hit the random button. And I found this one called the Virtual Reality Experiment. Basically, it was the first one that popped up in Creepypasta Wiki. So, pretty much without further ado, we're going to get started. So let's begin. Hope you guys are ready for this. The Virtual Reality Experiment. A few years before the time of this writing, there was an experiment to test a phenomenal invention. If the test was successful, it could have potentially revolutionized the world of video games forever. The invention was a virtual reality gaming console that would actually put eager players into the game so they could vividly experience it, instead of just play it. It sounded like something from unrealistic science fiction, but the developers had spent years building it and made sure it was ahead of the rest of the gaming industry by far. The console was to be called the Immersion, and it would have instantly made every other console obsolete. It wasn't like the kind of system where you have to wear a visor over your eyes like the Oculus Rift and still hold a controller. It would have generated an entire virtual world, unlike any other before it, for players to explore. The game would generate sounds, smells, sights, even a temperature. Once the gamer began playing, it was as if they'd stepped into another world for an adventure. Sometimes, the game would give them items to use, and there would be people inside the game to interact with. People who wander around the world, heroes, villains, and neutrals. The game would create situations and the player would have to solve them. The immersion actually put the player into the story. It was an advanced piece of technology far beyond today's limitations, and it held a certain tempting beauty to it that attracted almost every major business to hear of it. The way the immersion worked was by getting into your head. Basically, the system would put you into a sleep-like condition and control the dreams you had. It was complicated and a very sophisticated device. The only thing players had as a controller was a helmet over their heads for the machine to work. Anyone who was wearing the helmet should have moved only a little bit when playing the game, and a curious sensation known as sleepwalking, similar to how they would in actual slumber. If you died or lost in the game, the immersion would simply wake you up. Only 3 games were made for the immersion, and the games took almost as much time as the console itself. Tests were required to make sure the game worked properly, so researchers were hired to examine the console. However, developers wanted to keep the invention a secret so that no other company could steal their idea or make a console to rival the immersion, which was highly unlikely. The researchers found 3 people to play the games developed for the system. The names were Mark, Luke, and Wayne. Each of them was a devoted gamer. The researchers let them pick the games they played after an explanation about each game. There was a game called Warworld, which was a shooting game. The player would start in a helicopter wearing a full standard issue army uniform. They had just enough time to look around the slick black interior of the helicopter. With the pilot and co-pilot chairs in the front, a wooden crate next to the player on the floor, and the door to the helicopter wide open, revealing a height so high the ground was scarcely visible. At the moment of looking around, the pilot would told... That's bad grammar here. Bad grammar. Okay. I'll have to change this. At a moment of looking around, the pilot told them to grab a parachute, a gun from the crate, and then to jump out of the helicopter. The immersion would have made it all the more terrifying than pressing a button and walking forward. It would make the player smell the air at a high altitude and feel the overpowering strength of the helicopter blades as he stood in the doorway, staring down at the earth, where a layer of dust concealed the ground. And then the player would fall from the helicopter, just before a missile was fired to shoot the helicopter down behind them as they fell to the ground. The player would actually feel the heat of the explosion scraping their back. The explosion would have been deafeningly loud and scattering flaming helicopter pieces everywhere. The player would then have to pull the ripcord of the parachute to land in the middle of a war zone with the gun they chose. Each soldier, friendly or enemy, would have custom faces, different stories and personalities, and different techniques. This was the game Mark would play. The next game was titled Diesel Drag, a racing game. It started with the player walking through a tunnel onto a racetrack, and there would be lines of race cars arranged, all different types and models. All the players had to do was climb inside one, turn the ignition, and then all the other cars would suddenly have drivers in them, ready to race. There had been plenty of tracks designed. The racetracks ranged from NASCAR-type track to a forest drive to wild public racing through a city. The immersion had also created a world off the racetrack in case the player went off-road. The NASCAR track had spectators wandering around the boundaries. The forest had trees and woodland animals, and the city had individual shops with different people inside. This was the game that Luke would play. The third and final game developed for the immersion was the most vivid of them all. The developers saw an opportunity to make a horror game, an actual scary one, unlike any made before, and they decided to make one for the immersion. Hours of time went into making the monster look intimidating and frightening, and weeks went into creating how he would behave in the game. The game was called The Abhorrent. The players, being strapped to a table, would find their arms tied down, and if they struggled, the player would find the right arm was loose and possible to twist out of the binds. The room was empty, aside from the table. Looking around, the player would see the room was a perfect square with stone walls and an iron door. After about 20 seconds, a white-haired man would enter the room with a long butcher knife. If the player was free, or nearly free, he would attack. If the player appeared to still be strapped down, he would stand over them and begin whispering about how much he would love to see the blade enter the flesh, and other psychotic things such as this. To make this moment even creepier, a few developers had their extended conversations with murderous asylum inmates who had stabbed victims to death, only to get a feel for the emotion required for this man. The player could overpower the man and knock him to the ground, or push him past him and escape. Either way, they had to get out of the room. Once they escaped the room, the old man would call after them just before the iron door slammed shut. "You can't escape. Come back, or he will find you." He led to be the monster. The player's goal was to navigate their way through the maze-like cave system while avoiding it. The developers had made sure to put plenty of obstacles, objects, and details into the maze. There were broken chairs to throw at the monster to slow it down, large tree roots growing out of the walls to force the player to climb over or slide under, and piles of rocks and gravel to hide behind. But the monster was unrelenting in his bloodthirsty search. Wayne, who was apparently a horror addict, had practically begged to play this game. With every researcher and developer gathered in a large room, Mark, Luke, and Wayne were strapped down to 3 tables before the immersion helmets were placed over their heads. A button was pressed, and the games were started. Within a minute, all 3 gamers had fallen into a sleep-like state, occasionally mumbling about "shoot that one" or "pass him," or sometimes kicking slightly. The immersion helmets were hooked up to 3 large television screens so everybody could see what the gamers saw in a first-person view. The experiment was going almost exactly as planned, so developers and researchers alike were prepared to celebrate, but their celebration was cut tragically short. The gamers began to thrash around. Mark, who had been in the middle of shooting an enemy soldier with his machine gun in Warworld, was now screaming, his cries growing in pitch every time he stopped to take a breath. Terrified researchers jumped backward as blood began to spurt from Mark's body. Small wounds that looked to be bullet holes had covered Mark's chest. And then his screams began to die. In only a few moments, Mark had turned from an avid gamer into a bullet-hole-filled corpse. Luke was next. Luke began jerking from side to side. His car in game was going off the track. He was fighting to keep it on. He may have succeeded, but suddenly another race car came along and knocked him off the track. Luke told the developers to put it on the forest track, the same track the developers had chosen to put a large fenceless cliff overlooking a long hill. Luke's car spun over and over again as it rolled off the steep cliff and down the hill. The car went into midair for a moment and then hit the ground with a terrible screech of metal. Luke's sleeping body quivered for a moment, and then there was a loud cracking noise as his neck snapped, along with a few other bones. All was still. Then the car exploded. Luke's body erupted into flames, and researchers were astounded at the sudden spontaneous human combustion. A few ran for the fire extinguisher, but all that remained of Luke was a black hunk of meat and a burning smell. At this point, the developers and researchers alike were trying to stop the game. Wayne was playing. If they had simply pulled off his helmet, Wayne's brain might have been permanently damaged. They couldn't turn off the game. They could only watch him play. Wayne's arm had been cut while escaping the old man in the beginning of the game, and a thick gash appeared in reality, staining his shirt sleeves with blood. After escaping the old man, Wayne was now running for his life down the caves. The monster's roar echoed behind him in the distant darkness at the end of the tunnel. Wayne found himself in a large, open area. He looked around for a few seconds, and in came the sound of thundering footsteps. He cast a quick, frightened glance to the dark tunnel he had just emerged from, and then looked around the area again. There was a large rock over to the side, and Wayne quickly scrambled behind it. He froze, trying to not even breathe as the footsteps entered the room. Then, the sound of the monster sniffing. Wayne stared at the ground, hardly daring to move the slightest bit. The monster stopped, and there was silence. Wayne cautiously began to raise his head up to look at the top of the rock. There was no sound. Suddenly, a large, clawed hand shot down over the top of the rock. There was a loud growl, and Wayne screamed. The claws managed to seize him around the chest and pulled him from his hiding spot. In reality, Wayne's body opened up with more scratches, leaking up even more blood. The monster hoisted him into the air and threw him to the ground. Wayne looked up and got a glimpse of the monster. Its face resembled a human skull, having two dark eyes and a stubby nose. The eyes held two green orbs that cut through Wayne like hunter's eyes. The monster had a mouth, like a gaping chasm with long, sharp teeth. Its body was large and brown with long legs. Long appendages grew from under its arms, wrapping around Wayne and pulling him into the air upside down. Wayne screamed and put his arms in front of him as some sort of defense, and then the monster's mouth opened wide and pulled Wayne into itself before its mouth closed, chomping the man as though he were like nothing more than a piece of bread. In reality, Wayne's body fell open, exposing a broken skull and meaty insides. His lifeless eyes still remained in his head, staring out of the holes in his skull. Many of the scientists vomited. In the game, the monster threw Wayne down. The green light in its eyes died, reducing them to pure black. The monster on the TV screen looked right at the developers with its dark holes, and thick black sludge began to fall from its eyes to the floor. Its mouth slowly fell open, releasing even more of the sludge. Almost everybody watching the experiment, the developers, the researchers, immediately fled the room. Those who remained, only 5 people, watched the monster slowly turn its head to the side as it stared before the TV finally shut off. All records of the immersion have been destroyed, and it's as though it never happened. Nothing like it's ever been attempted since then. A year after the experiment took place, all 5 of the people who stayed with Wayne until the TV turned off were found dead. Each of them was a confirmed suicide. The most chilling part about the suicides, other than the fact they all took place on the same day, was that each body was found next to a household television set, and each television was tuned to nothing but static. So yeah, there we go. How's that? Yeah, that's what happened to Mark last night. How's it going, everybody? Sorry I didn't have much of a conversation go with you guys, but when you're reading a story out like this, you have to just keep going with the story, and I really do hope you enjoyed it. So I'd just like to say hi, Lost History Channel TKTC. How's it going, you Scottish git? Hello, Miss Titty McSwaggins. Hello, Industrial Angel. Oh, it's been a fun day today, hasn't it? So yeah, that's definitely what happened to Mark last night. Thing like that before I switched the stream off. I quite enjoyed doing that as a live stream. I might do a stream one day where I do several creepypasta readings, or maybe even I might even do some of the SCP containment, not containment breach, that's the game, the SCP Foundation stuff. So we'll see what happens. I'll need to put a link in the description as to what this is. Actually, I could do that in the chat just now. There's a link to the story. There it is, right there.
Oh, yes. It was a great story. A very good one indeed.
Oh, vape voice. Get a little vape voice. What did you think of the sound effect when he snapped his neck? I just need to click my arm at the time, and it just kind of worked with that. I don't know why. I just thought it'd be fun to do that. So yeah, that's pretty much what I did. Yes. What's that noise? You guys hear that? Do you guys hear that? What the hell?